My parents moved when I was 6 years old from my birthplace in northern Minnesota to the high desert of eastern Oregon, where I grew up. After earning a 1972 BA in International Affairs from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, I completed MA and PhD degrees at Berkeley and then moved across the country in 1976 to my first job at Bowdoin College in Maine. From 1979 to 2002, I taught in the sociology department at the University of South Carolina, where this article was written. After a leave of absence from USC to work at the Max Planck Institute in Rostock, Germany for a couple of years, I moved again to Florida State University to become the Charles Nam Professor in Sociology of Population. This article diverges from my main demographic research focus. The research it reports grew out of my personal involvement in the Lutheran Church, which gave me access to the site of the study at a statewide church convention. The most important idea in the article is the contrast between what I called grounded versus floating religious organizations and the possibility that these structural alternatives not only compete with each other for our time and loyalties, but also shape each other through their interactions. If you look around, you see bewildering diversity in the ways people organize their attempts to share personal religious experiences. Scholars trying to make some sense out of this diversity have come up with several ways to see patterns in religious organization. This article starts by reviewing one such perspective dealing with questions of authority and control. Who gets to make the rules for how group religious life will be conducted? Perhaps reflecting the hierarchical structure of medieval society, Christianity in Europe developed over many centuries in the direction of a centralized hierarchy of authority and control. The Roman Catholic Church provides a classic example of what we might call the episcopal form of religious polity, which simply means rule by bishops. The Episcopalian Protestant denomination has that name precisely because it follows the episcopal form of religious polity, but so do religious groups like the Catholic Church. In this system, each layer of religious organization takes orders from a central authority figure above it. All the people in a congregation are subordinate to their priest. The priest obeys a bishop, and so on up to the Pope in Rome for Roman Catholics. The centralized church owns all cathedrals, schools, cemeteries, and all other church property. Priests are assigned to parishes by their bishops. The Episcopal model is a top-down command and control system of religious polity. This centralized church hierarchy solves some basic problems faced by people who want to share an organized religious life with each other. Given the intensely private nature of personal religious experience and the difficulty of sharing this with anyone else outside yourself, it's all too easy for people to interpret such experiences differently, and so to come up with different ways of expressing their religiosity and different conclusions about how to respond to these experiences in everyday actions. Coordinating a large and growing population of believers so that they don't come into conflict with each other demands some kind of authority to say what is the correct set of doctrines and beliefs, or orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means right or straight doctrine, just as an orthodontist works to give you right or straight teeth. A centralized authority also decrees what is orthopraxis, that is, correct or straight practices to express these beliefs. Things such as infant versus adult baptism, whether women can be ordained as priests, and other rules about people getting married, getting divorced, adopting children, going to confession, not killing other people, and so on. If any disputes arise about questions of right doctrine or right practice, there is only one right answer, and it comes down the chain of command in this episcopal system of religious polity. Eventually, though, the hierarchical feudal order of European society gave way to the commercial revolution organized around markets, competition, trading, and business. As secular hierarchies headed by emperors and kings broke down into nation-states, The religious hierarchy of the episcopal system also came under attack in the Reformation. The opposite of the episcopal system is usually known as the congregational system of religious polity. This congregational system turns the older system on its head by placing ultimate authority in the local congregation itself. In this system, that local congregation owns its own church building, decides on its own who to call to be a minister in it, and generally gets to make all the rules for how shared religious life is going to be lived in that congregation. Larger groupings or denominations like the Southern Baptists, the National Baptists, the Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and all the rest depend for their existence on the voluntary participation of each local congregation. A congregation can pull out of such larger groupings anytime they like because they collect their own offerings, pay their own pastor's salary, and control all the rest of their congregational life. You can see where this is likely to lead, though, and you don't even need to use your imagination. Just drive around any American town or city and you will see the result. As my mother used to say, it seems like there's a church behind every other tree, and no two of them are quite alike. The tendency for one local congregation to get into a squabble with another, or perhaps even within itself, produces a constant churning of schisms in religious groups organized on the congregational principle. Schism comes from the same root word as scissors and refers to cutting something into pieces. And why not? Who's to say that everybody needs to agree to the same religious doctrines and behave in exactly the same ways as a consequence of those beliefs? We can come back to this issue another day. What is crucial for this article is that both of these approaches to governing a religion, the episcopal and the congregational extremes of organization, share one common assumption. Both of them assume that people gather together in little local geographic groups, like the cells in a leaf, and the basic problem is then how to connect all these little local congregations. This is, in fact, quite a good description of religious organization in Europe and the Americas, and reflects the religious history of Europe back to the Middle Ages. The medieval Catholic Church divided the map of Europe into a jigsaw puzzle of thousands and thousands of local parishes, with a parish church manned by a parish priest at the center of each one, responsible for all the souls inside the parish boundary. This was the medieval solution to the problem of organizing and coordinating a shared religious life for millions of people inhabiting this vast territory. Not every great world religion has chosen this kind of cellular boundary drawing in order to create a command and control hierarchy to guarantee orthodoxy and orthopraxis. But the ancient European solution has shaped contemporary religious life, at least in the Western Hemisphere, so thoroughly that we take for granted that all religious groups are organized into local congregations with geographic boundaries. When one denomination decides to found a new mission congregation somewhere, they actually sit down with maps showing the existing churches and decide where there's a geographic gap on the map to place the new church. Whether the lines of decision-making run upward from congregations to the larger religious organization, or downward from some centralized hierarchy, all of these religious groups are built from the building blocks of local congregations. I call this cellular territorial system a grounded religious organization, literally planted in the ground like rows of trees in an orchard. From the earliest days of European incursions into the Americas, this jigsaw puzzle approach of grounded religious organization has taken root, so to speak, and came to dominate the religious landscape. Methodist circuit riders and Baptist camp meetings may have reached out beyond the established saltwater church congregational boundaries along the coastlines, but once they did their work, these missionaries saw the new believers forming new local congregations deeper inland, and the jigsaw puzzle of grounded churches just kept getting bigger and bigger. However, the central point of this article is that grounded religious organizations, so familiar that we just take them for granted, are no longer the only game in town. It's time to look at a newer alternative. Whenever any group of people manage to organize a way to share their personal religious experiences. In other words, when they're able to merge into a religious group, you can be almost certain that some individual will become dissatisfied with something about that group. If you are such a person, you have two basic choices. Either you can put up with what you see as flaws or problems and go along with the existing arrangement, make the best of it, or you can try to change things and resolve such problems. It takes a certain kind of personality to strike out on your own to urge innovation and change in an established religious tradition. Such entrepreneurs have appeared over and over again in the religious history of the United States, and an extensive literature documents the awakenings provoked by these religious entrepreneurs from time to time. The most important feature of the Great Awakenings for us here arises from the fact that if you set yourself against any established religion, you no longer can rely on that grounded hierarchy of organized local congregations and their leaders for support. You have to find a way to operate outside that grounded hierarchy. For example, George Whitefield, born in England in 1711, became a friend and follower of John Wesley and moved with the Wesleys to the United States at age 22. A gifted speaker, Whitefield began to preach that the most important part of religious life was personal rebirth and inspiration, rather than following established routines for worship and life in general. His message antagonized Anglican leaders in the American colonies, but he attracted huge audiences with his sermons and began preaching to crowds outdoors. He also became good friends with Benjamin Franklin, who began to publish his sermons in newspapers and pamphlets. Whitefield became known as the Grand Itinerant because to attract his audience, he had to travel continuously all over the country preaching. He played a key role in what we call today the First Great Awakening. There have been other periods of revival, other awakenings, and in all of them, we find these individual religious entrepreneurs preaching a message of change, usually focusing on your inner spiritual life as an individual rather than singing the praises of organized religious traditions and grounded hierarchies of established congregations. The siren call of personal spirituality seems to work in every place and time to attract followers out of such established traditional religious groups and motivate them to become followers of the new religious entrepreneurs. While Whitefield had to rely on how far he could project the sound of his voice, and perhaps later on how many copies of his sermons Benjamin Franklin could print up for distribution, over the past couple of centuries, the channels by which the religious entrepreneur can reach out with a new message have expanded tremendously. In the 1800s, advanced publicity in newspapers was the key to bringing hundreds or even thousands of witnesses to the public spectacles that became known as revivals. The advent of radio and television broadcasts, and now the parallel virtual world of the internet that surrounds us all, have made it possible for today's religious entrepreneurs to reach theoretically unlimited populations of potential followers. Media evangelism has become a viable lifetime career, not just a risky experiment with limited potential and a demanding lifestyle of constant road trips. Scholars who study the phenomenon of social movements in general will find this history of great awakenings and religious entrepreneurs very familiar. They have developed a formal model of such movements called the resource mobilization model and have applied it to the campaigns of political candidates, to groups who oppose induced abortions, to people who want to protect the environment, to those fighting against racial discrimination, and yes, to our religious entrepreneurs and their religious movements. These various movements all display a similar form. At the top, we find the movement leaders or entrepreneurs who try to recruit and mobilize followers from the general population, hopefully turning them into active followers and participants in the movement. These participants provide the resources of time, energy, and money that sustain the movement and keep the central leadership of movement entrepreneurs going. When we look at this resource mobilization model of social movements against the backdrop of conventional religious organizations built up on a foundation of lots of geographically grounded local congregations, it should become apparent at once that now we are dealing with an entirely different sort of social organization, one without any such segmented, localized root system of grounded support. Rather than a grounded, bottom-up form of organization, we are looking at a top-down organization that we might think of as floating across the surface of society the way that a jellyfish floats along in the ocean. These floating religious organizations of the media evangelists today have become viable permanent forms because we have filled up our social ocean with the new forms of communication that allow them to float around and attract mass audiences without any of the bother of local congregations. These floating religious groups have the same relation to grounded religious organizations that internet retailers like Amazon have to local brick-and-mortar stores. Once we recognize this clear contrast between grounded and floating religious groups, not to say perhaps the conflict between them as competing forms of social organization, the next important question we need to ask concerns exactly how grounded and floating religious groups interact with each other. Are they mortal enemies locked in combat for the loyalties of the same potential followers? Or is the picture more complicated than that? We often see successful media evangelists put down local roots in at least one spot, like Robert Schuller with his Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles, Jerry Falwell with his gigantic Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, and countless similar cases. On the other hand, we also see many congregations and other levels within established, grounded churches bringing TV cameras into sanctuaries and developing virtual media ministries. Grounded and floating forms of religious organization clearly appear to be tangled up with each other. This article explores the interface between these two structural alternatives for religious organization. Both ordained and lay leaders of one such grounded organization, the South Carolina Synod of the Lutheran Church in America, gathered for their annual conference many years ago. As one of the delegates, I offered to help to assess the opinions about how the conference went, and also inserted a couple of extra questions into the questionnaire that the Synod leadership distributed for all delegates to fill out. These questionnaires asked whether the respondent ever listened to the virtual preaching and other messages from media evangelists, and whether the respondent had ever sent in any money to these media evangelists. From their answers, we can observe the front lines of contact between grounded and floating religious organizations. It would be interesting to repeat this project nearly half a century later to see whether anything has changed since then. To see what I found at the interface between grounded and floating religious organizations, we can start with a quick profile of the 278 convention delegates who completed the data collection instrument, the Conference Evaluation Questionnaire. The way the conference was designed ensured that roughly equal numbers of ordained ministers and lay delegates came to the day-long meeting. However, most people were satisfied to just listen and vote on reports and motions from the small group of people taking an active role presenting conference business. Only about a fifth of those present took such active roles. The average age of the delegates was about 45 years old, and by their own self-reporting, they split into similarly sized groups by political orientations of liberal, moderate, or conservative. This is our cast of characters, the people who represent what the title of this article calls a conventional religious hierarchy. These delegates, all with leadership positions in their local grounded congregations, answered a bunch of questions giving reactions to the conference when it was nearly over. Most of these questions evaluated things like travel issues, the venue where the conference took place, and the like, but 2 questions introduced into that questionnaire give us the information we need about contacts the delegates may have had with media evangelism. The first question simply asked whether the person had ever listened to media evangelism broadcasts. This could cover radio or television broadcasts because at the time the internet had not yet been invented. I was interested and even surprised to discover that 2 out of every 3 of these church leaders reported that they had indeed listened to media evangelists. The question did not ask about any details, such as which evangelist or message got their attention, so some of the older delegates may have thought about broadcasts of the Lutheran Hour that once appeared on radio stations as part of their commitment to provide public service broadcasting. We'll return to this issue another time. The second question, asking whether the respondents had ever sent in financial contributions to a media evangelist in response to the broadcast pleas for money, turned up positive responses for 1 of every 9 delegates who filled out the questionnaires. This means that about 1 of every 6 people who had listened to media evangelism broadcasts had also followed up by sending the evangelists money. Clearly, such floating religious organizations had managed to penetrate within the leadership ranks of a conventional grounded church to gain people's attention and even their financial support to some extent. Of course, the extent of this penetration by media evangelism varied depending on the backgrounds of the people as sorted out above. Before discussing such results, we need to be clear that the different characteristics like age, ordained status, politics, and so on were not independent of each other. For example, the conservative delegates tended to be older than the liberal ones, and a bigger share of the clergy than of the laymen got involved actively in presenting the convention. Due to these overlaps between different background characteristics, the information in Table 1 of the article has to be adjusted. To do this, I analyzed the responses using a statistical technique that sorts out how much of the variation in contact with media evangelism was due to each factor considered independently of its association with the others. For each factor, 1 category serves as a reference group, and the odds of listening to a media evangelist broadcast is set to 1 for that group. For example, we set the observed rate of listening to 1.0 for delegates under age 45. Relative to that baseline, delegates age 45 or older were 1.9 times more likely to have listened, roughly twice as likely. Compared to people who described themselves as politically liberal, moderates were also nearly twice as likely to report listening, and conservatives had double the odds of listening compared even to the moderates. Laymen reported listening more than twice as often as clergy, and the same was true for delegates who just sat and listened rather than presenting any of the business of the conference. All of these patterns make sense if we think of media evangelism as an alternative form of organization competing with a conventional grounded religious hierarchy. The more involved these delegates were in that grounded hierarchy of the church, the less they had listened to media evangelism broadcasts. Things are not as simple and clear-cut when we look into who was sending money to the media evangelists, though. For most combinations of categories of the different considered background characteristics of people, hardly anybody admitted sending in financial contributions. There were 2 main clusters of contributors revealed by questionnaire responses. The strongest odds of having sent in money appeared among older laymen, those over age 45, with the exception of those who described themselves as liberals. For the older lay, moderates, and conservatives, odds of sending money varied between 0.36 and 0.50. But we need to remember that odds of 0.5 to 1 mean that 5 people made such contributions for every 10 who did not. Odds of 0.5 represent about 1/3 of the respondents sending money, not half of them. The other more puzzling cluster of contributors appeared among the younger ordained ministers at the conference. The young ministers who described themselves as conservatives sometimes had sent in money, while hardly any of the other ministers present reported doing so. Even though this was quite a small group of ministers, it provides the clearest evidence that media evangelism had made some inroads even among the ordained clergy of the church. What do these results suggest? For one thing, the past half-century featured a steady decline in the membership reported by nearly all mainline Protestant denominations in the United States. We might wonder, based on results of this study, whether some of that membership decline was linked to more people turning to media evangelism as a source of religious inspiration in their lives. On the other hand, these results also may suggest a kind of convergence going on in the organization or structure of American religion. Some of the media messages to which some delegates had listened and responded could have been broadcast by their own congregations or by the central leadership operations of their own church. The coronavirus pandemic undoubtedly caused a tremendous acceleration of most grounded church congregations in this direction recently. To the extent that grounded churches get into the media business and media evangelists put down roots in local congregations, both sides of this structural confrontation may be moving toward a new, innovative compromise in the ways that people can share their personal religious experience in organized ways.